Hello, friends of YouTube. Welcome back to Mike Reads the World. Today, we're taking care of some unfinished business and going back to Brazil, where I've only read a graphic novel so far for this project. So, we're going to begin with The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector. Uh, it's going to be an interesting one to talk about, we'll just say, because since I've started doing the booktube and YouTubing and literature, um, I cannot get away from videos popping up about uh, this Brazilian woman's literature. And I've definitely been interested. It's been on my radar for some time. But I have to admit, and I will say I did enjoy this book, and I'm going to give a positive talk about it. So don't let this scare you. But if you do like her, but I did go to the bookstore several times, open up her books, and decide, you know what, this is just kind of pretentious, and I don't really like it. When I was just kind of reading the opening, chapters or flipping through it, particularly, what did I try? Agua Viva, The Passion of GH. A lot of her books, when I'd open up and started reading them, it was just kind of this style of writing that I don't really care for, which is just kind of I just don't find it meaningful. It's saying a lot of kind of quasi philosophical things that I associate, I guess, in my mind with stuff like Paulo Coelho and that sort of thing. I don't know. And some people are probably going to be absolutely scandalized by that, but that was my first impression. However, I am glad that I this one caught my eye, The Hour of the Star, and I just thought, there's so many people, smart people that I follow and listen to that get into Clarice Lispector. There's got to be something to it. So I did end up getting The Hour of the Star. The story of it appealed to me more than just about any other. It also appealed to me because of the fact that she wrote this in the last year of her life without knowing that she was going to pass away unexpectedly, and that this book was kind of something different for her. There's several things about this book that are different, it seems, than what she typically does, but it's also a synthesis of kind of all of what she does. So this seems like, it will go down as her classic and probably the most important book to recommend and read by her, although I'm sure that's debatable. But I'm glad I picked this one. It's again one of those books that I, you can tell someone what happens in it, and my experience of reading this book, it begins and ends with a very similar line, and it ties itself together um, interestingly in that way. It also opens up with like this list of 12 different titles for the novel, or is it 8? I'm not even sure, but it's The Hour of the Star, It's All My Fault, or The Hour of the Star, or Let Her Deal with It, or The Right to Scream, As for the Future, or Singing the Blues, or She Doesn't Know How to Scream, or Sense of Loss, or Whistling in the Dark Wind, or I Can't Do Anything, or Account of the Preceding Facts, or Cheap Tearjerker, or Discreet Exit Through the Back Door, are all essentially alternate titles for this book, and that's really interesting. And I was like, okay, is this kind of like a style over substance thing? Which is my immediate suspicion of very like postmodern type of works. Like, um, that's kind of my biggest pet peeve in literature is when books have a gimmick or something, but the gimmick doesn't really mean anything. And in this case, I don't think it's a gimmick. You can actually read this story through the filter of all of those titles, and it gives it a different meaning. And it actually, this list of titles is very rich in interpretation if you filter the book through each title. It begins, all the world began with a yes. One molecule said yes to another molecule, and life is born. I love kind of this, it opens in a very mythic way. Um, and then we're introduced to the narrator of the story, which is actually a man, which I believe this is the only novel where the narrator of the story is male. And but he is just an author. So in some ways it almost confused my brain in the sense that I'm like still imagining this as Clarice Lispector writing her thoughts, but the narrator is so is definitely a different character, but like it's hard for me to separate that in my brain because he's talking about a book that he's trying to write. So it's like a novel that breaks the fourth wall, but contained within itself. So it never actually breaks the fourth wall because the author of the story is his own character in the book. And he is obsessed with this simple girl who, in the Portuguese version, would be a nordestina, a girl, young woman from the northeast of Brazil who has moved to Rio and lives in Rio, and she has a job as a typist, which she's not very good at. She's about to get fired. She's described as like so simple and so poor, like not just poor in material terms to the point where like she only eats hot dogs and like is material poor, but the poverty of this woman is more in her lack of education, her lack of ambition, her lack of striving to be anything else but what she is. Um, and it's very left open ended as to whether this is her own fault or society's fault. Uh, or even, in some ways she is this girl that he apparently, the author of the story, the fictional author of the story that Clarice is using as her vehicle to narrate it. He is uh, projecting onto this, he's creating this girl as such a caricature, and he's like only seen her once in the street or something. She's got like splotches on her face. He describes her as ugly, but he loves her because she's different. Or no, not that she's different, because she isn't different. He loves her because she is like so normal that the entire world overlooks her. um, and almost to the point of absurdity. This is a reference that, unless you speak Spanish and have read very obscure works from the author Julio Ramon Ribeiro from Peru, has a story about a man. It's like his first story he ever wrote, but it's in his complete collected works that you'd have to get in Spanish. But it's about a man who is so normal. It's called La Vida Gris, or The Gray Life, about a man who's so normal that it's abnormal, and his life is so normal that it would be abnormal if there wasn't the fact that in one instance he actually won the lottery. So this guy is so normal that it's like, something strange has to happen in his life for it to be normal. So it's the gray life, right? And to me, this is kind of something similar is going on here, where this author is obsessed with telling the story about a girl who's just so normal, but you know, she. The other aspect of it is her ignorance. Her ignorance of how miserable her own life is, because she becomes romantically involved with a man, and this man treats her like absolute dirt. Like from the beginning that he meets her and she tells him her name, Macabea. And he says, "Oh, that sounds like a disease," or something like that. And so she, just accepts kind of this man who is just a typical factory worker, but has these big dreams of being a congressperson. Just kind of accepts his abusive talk and actions toward her, and but she's apparently happy, until her best friend Gloria steps in, who's described as a larger woman, and for this man represents a step up in life, because apparently that's a sign of more attractive uh, to him, or at least in the narrator's conscience. So the for she loses her boyfriend to her best friend, and then her best friend advises her to go see a fortune teller. She also sees a doctor, and then what happens when she leaves the fortune teller is the end of the story, which I won't spoil. But like that's it. Basically, this whole thing. When I got to the end of it, I was like, or as I was getting to the end and kind of the major final event of the story happened, I was thinking this is almost like an episode of Tales from the Crypt, and and like it's not a very inventive story, but the author is even aware of that. And I'm not talking Clarice, the author. I'm talking her character, the author, Rodrigo, who's struggling. So the other thing you have to know too about this book, the first like 20 pages of the book is mostly just the author struggling with the idea of writing the story. And I was like, is the entire book going to be this? Are we not even going to learn about this girl that he's apparently obsessed with? Because it seems more like he's just obsessed with himself and his own, ideas about writing this book. And it's like it almost makes me feel like there has to be something somewhat autobiographical here that Clarice Lispector is putting in, and thinking of herself as, and Rodrigo is obviously an upper class author man, and he's trying to write this story about a poor woman, like a life so different from his he can barely comprehend it. And if you look into Clarice Lispector's life a little bit, you could see that potentially being autobiographical. But I don't really want to get into her life. I just want to focus on this story. So, yeah, by the end of it, I was like, this reminds me of a Tales from the Crypt story, like episode. If you've never seen Tales from the Crypt or don't know what I'm talking about, they're basically these short, campy, uh, not necessarily scary stories. They're often like ironic tragedies where things are going to end badly for the main character, and they kind of not through their own fault, or just kind of leaving one desperate situation, making a deal with the devil or something like that. They come to this like ironically tragic end by the end of the story, and sometimes there's nothing supernatural that's even happening in these Tales from the Crypt episodes. So it really reminded me of that. But there's something haunting about the way that Clarice Lispector writes it. The final the final three lines, or like the final paragraph of the novel, is incredibly haunting, and the final word of the novel is yes. Yes. And that yes, when I read it, I just kind of stopped and I just stared at that yes at the end of the novel for a, about I don't know, 2 minutes maybe, just trying to absorb what I just read, because it immediately brought me back to the beginning when it said all the world began with a yes. Um, yeah, all the world began with a yes. And the story ends with the word yes. Now, for that to mean anything to you, you have to know what is said in that last paragraph. And if you know, you know. But I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't and is just listening to this. I do actually recommend this book, even though my first impressions of Clarice Lispector were not great. I don't. Now, one thing I will also say, excuse me, I also have this. When I was in Brazil back in 2017. I visited Brazil uh, for about a month and traveled around a bit. I got the Os 100 Melhores Contos Brasileiros do Século. Pardon my Portuguese. I'm fluent in Spanish, but not Portuguese. But I can read quite well in Portuguese, or I'm getting there. I'm getting to the point. I won't say quite well. I can tolerably read in Portuguese with the help of a translator. So there are four. To translate this, it's the 100 best Brazilian stories of the century, talking about the 20th century, right? So 100 stories in here, short stories. Clarice Lispector has 4. That, I believe, is more than any single author. There are plenty that have 2, and there might be some that have 3, but Clarice Lispector, I believe, is, from what I could tell, the only one in this book that has 4 stories of the 100. Um, and I read all 4 actually today, before this video, because I wanted to get an idea of not only how she reads in Portuguese, but also just to get an idea of her short stories. And they really are quite different from at least this Hour of the Star novel I wrote. They are more stories, situational stories, simple stories. The ones that are in here that are, I guess, considered in Brazil to be her best, at least according to this collection. Um, Amor, or Love, uh, Feliz Aniversario, which is Happy Birthday, Uma Galinha, or a chicken, and Felicidade Clandestina, which is like clandestine happiness. I don't know exactly how that translates. Um, they were actually all really good. They were all really thought provoking. Amor might be my favorite. I think it's between no, it's between Amor and Felicidade Clandestina. It's between those two. But they were all good. They were all really great. So if I were to read something else by Clarice Lispector, I think it would be her anthology of short stories. I would probably get them in English though for ease of reading, because my Portuguese just isn't quite there yet, and it took a considerable amount of time to get through these very short stories with a translator. So, uh, uh, you know, Google Translate basically. I didn't even mention when I read Hour of the Star, and then I also there is a somebody um, posted a video just reading the entire thing in Portuguese, like an audiobook of Hour of the Star, Hora da Estrela, I think it is. But yeah, you can find it on YouTube, and just listen to it in Portuguese while you read it in English, and it's kind of an interesting experience. That's what I did anyway. But I feel like that worked for me. I don't know, because I have some exposure to the language, and like, um, of course, having Spanish first, you can understand a lot more Portuguese. Although speaking it, I really cannot speak Portuguese, so not very well. I confuse it with Spanish. It's bad. Like just because visually they're such similar languages in some ways. It's like yeah, my brain just like flips back and forth. But hopefully I'll get better at that, and I really do want to be able to keep reading above all in Portuguese, because there's a lot of great literature in Portuguese that it's like it's right there. It's almost at my fingertips, and I'd love to be able to read more in the original language. So anyway, my second time through uh, the Hour of the Star, which I should say, you might be like, wow, you read this twice in like 3 days. Yeah, it's like 70 pages, and it's not long at all. It's like a long short story, more, or a very short novella. Um, and if you were to take out all the nonsense of the author trying to struggle with writing the story, it would be even shorter, which is another thing that's so bizarre about it, because it's just as much a story about the author, the fictional author of the story of the girl, as it is anything else. But something's happening on like an atomic level here, a psychological level, that just seems better or different than kind of the other things that I was trying to read by her picked up, but maybe I didn't give her other work enough of a chance. Um, I definitely would like to read more of her short stories, and that experience of reading it in English while listening to it in Portuguese gave me some insight as well. So I'll just leave with my final thoughts on that, which is I felt that I feel that Clarice Lispector's tone in English comes off a lot more like cold, aggressive, and pretentious. Maybe that's part of how it's translated. But when I listened to it in Portuguese, I didn't get that same sensation. It was a little bit more gentle, flowing, poetic. It like I got, and then the gap of reading it in English and listening to how it actually is in the Portuguese was really something. Was it there? Like a lot of the word, like this is a good translation, don't get me wrong, the things are translated for the most part quite literally. um, and even for Portuguese speakers, Clarice Lispector writes in a strange way, or readers I should say. um, she doesn't follow the exact rules of grammar. She's very much how she writes it, how she wants to write. She allows herself complete freedom in the writing. And that but I can't, there's a totally different sound, a totally different feel to her words and her personality when I listen to it on that audio version that's on YouTube in Portuguese than when I was looking at it, you know, in reading it in my own head in English. So I felt like that was worth mentioning, that uh, it could be that some of what turned me off to her works in English was just because of how they came off in English, and it's just a sort of style that in English uh, I don't care for. I don't know. It's speculation because I don't have a good literary vocabulary to be able to tell you like this is exactly why in these particular terms it rubs me the wrong way, or I didn't care for it. That was just my first impression, and actually I'm kind of curious. Today, I might go to the bookstore and just pick those up again, now having read her short stories in Portuguese and enjoyed Hour of the Star. And maybe I'll be able to get on the same wavelength as her earlier work, because The Passion of GH does sound pretty interesting, if not a little bit derivative of Kafka, but it might even be a book that's like in conversation with Kafka from the Metamorphosis, from the little that I know about it. So I would say her short stories and then possibly Passion of GH would be interested. I don't really find myself interested in a book like Agua Viva, which is, from what I can understand, pure poetry, between poetry and philosophy. I guess it's just I haven't, maybe I'm uncultured, but it's I haven't even really gotten ever into poetry in my life. I'm very strongly based in, I like prose, I like storytelling. I'm just not like I haven't gotten into poetry. Maybe it's a world I want to explore though, and try to get, not try, because like poetry is for people who get poetry. It seems like they just get it right, and it takes I don't know. I think it's just something I need to give it time and to attempt. So sorry for indulging in my own self introspection. I suppose that's one of the things I almost even criticized about Clarice here. But yeah, definitely was a good book, and I'm going to be reading one more Brazilian author, the from it's Machado de Assis, the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, which is a national classic of Brazil, and probably the Brazilian novel and author alongside Clarice Lispector that's getting the most attention, at least in the United States, because that's who I see on the bookshelves. I really don't see any other Brazilian authors besides those two on the bookshelves in my country here. So, uh, yeah, thanks for watching again. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll also be doing another Mike Reads the States shortly. I'm not sure the order that all this is going to happen or when, but it should be coming pretty quickly. So, yeah, thanks. Feel free to leave comments and subscribe if you like the channel. Take care.